As always, there's just a superabundance of things I could be talking with you about today. But the one I'm going to concentrate on, and you probably recognize the artwork at this point, has to do with inequality. And in particular, talking about inequality on the beginning of the second month of the government shutdown, the day in which the food benefit in your electronic benefits card, if you are a recipient of supplemental nutrition assistance from the federal government, didn't go out, right? And I will say more about this in a few minutes. But having given that as the pretext, the reason for talking about this today, I'll just note at the very beginning that means that 42 million Americans are going to be put into greater food insecurity than they already were in. It means that although there were at least two decisions by judges yesterday that what the Trump administration was doing in withholding these benefits was not legal, and that there is an emergency fund that they are required to distribute, it's still an open question. Will these benefits go out? If so, when? How long will the government shutdown continue for? Please note, right, that there is $5 billion in the emergency fund that the Trump administration was directed to distribute yesterday. And the average annual budget for supplemental nutrition, and did I say annual? I'm sorry. The average monthly budget for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is nearly $9 billion a month, right? And so the idea that although it may not be the case that the benefits are cut off as of today, we don't know how soon the benefits will go back out. And if they do go back out, one thing seems certain: they will not make it through Thanksgiving, right? And so please note that what this means is, on the one hand, that there are tens of millions of children in the United States whose ability to get the minimum requisite number of calories to develop and flourish is in jeopardy. And in addition to that, I'll just add very quickly that if you, right, as many of us have been, were a parent, I hope that you haven't had this experience. But if you are, right, a parent who doesn't know whether they're going to have to send their kid to school hungry on Monday, doesn't know if they're going to have to send their kid to bed hungry at some point in the coming weeks, it is a consuming kind of anxiety that you experience, right? Because you're failing in what you consider to be what society says is one of your most fundamental duties. And if you are, right, a person equipped with a moral compass, right, a normal range of human emotions, the idea that the incapacity to feed your child is a central failing. It eats at you, it distracts you, it, as the right social scientist likes to say, takes up all of your mental bandwidth. It makes it hard for you to do other things well, including parenting with the patience and nuance and emotional investment that good parenting requires. And so I add very quickly, right, that this is in the richest country in the world, a country where our wealth has increased substantially over the last few decades, at the same time that the percentage, not the percentage, the sheer bulk of our population that is in poverty has increased. And so I then add, right, that the Trump administration has found workarounds to continue to pay the immigration and customs enforcement officials and the other Department of Homeland Security officials, like prison officials, people running detention centers, that they consider to be essential, that they've solicited and received private donations, not only to continue to fund the military, but also to build a grotesque new ballroom that will disrupt the proportionality and the democratic aesthetics of the White House while they have refused to disperse money that is essential to feeding the most vulnerable Americans. It just seems to me it's a good time to talk again about inequality in the United States. And I'm going to use some fancy political science language here, repatrimonialization of American politics. And so the idea that our right policy repertoire, the tools in our policy toolkit are there. We know because we just did this to alleviate or maybe even vastly reduce poverty. But we don't use them. And let me be a little bit more nuanced. We use them very unevenly, right? When there's a Democrat in the White House and Democrats are in control of Congress, we use them somewhat more liberally, but certainly not adequately to do our best to eradicate poverty, to create a more equal society. And when Republicans are in the White House and in control of Congress, we do less. But generally speaking, there's so much more that we could do, and we're not doing it. Why are we not doing it? Well, I will say a couple things here. The first is that our system of government does not allow poor people to organize and express the strength that their numbers give, right? 1 in 8 Americans is a beneficiary of Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits. Why wouldn't they be an incredibly powerful voting bloc? They're in every congressional district in the United States. And the idea that we are so callous, so inhumane as a society that we're willing to continue paying the law enforcement officers that were terrorizing neighborhoods in Chicago on Halloween night while we don't feed the children of our citizens, right? That should be a potent political issue, one would think. And yet, what is clear is that the American political system, the federal government, with all of, in particular, the veto points it contains, the places you can go to block legislation, the ability to capture 1 or 2 key senators, or to make contributions, or to open revolving doors with regulatory authorities, or to capture the Supreme Court, as we've spoken about recently, means that the very wealthy are much more powerful than the poor. And for whatever reason, they prioritize the retention of their own wealth over the alleviation of poverty in the United States. Not each and every one of them, but on bulk. And the repatrimonialization refers to the fact that our government has been captured again by the wealthiest in our society. And this points to the fact that inequality is a self-reinforcing cycle. When the wealthiest among us have a high concentration of wealth in our society, it gives them the resources to capture our politics in the way just described. And so that's one element of the problem I want to speak with you about today. The other is that inequality isn't just reinforcing. In a very rich democratic society, it's also poisonous. it also sets us against each other. It also tends to give rise to a politics of resentment, grievance, and anger. And boy, are we seeing that play out in our politics in the United States in the last decade. In particular, if people are left poor in the midst of spectacular wealth and ostentatious consumption, they tend to get angry. And if they don't believe that their poverty is justified, that it's part of the natural world, or that it's legitimate, that it reflects their own moral failings, if instead they believe that the system is rigged against them, and they also believe that they live in a democratic society where the power structure, the policy making apparatus is meant to be accountable to them, then they begin to wonder who rigged the system? Why isn't it working? They may very well turn against democracy, may very well look for scapegoats to blame. Right. And so I want to say, right, we've been talking about this the last few weeks. America is coming apart. And what is tearing us apart, well, it's manifold, it's not simple. Social media and the siloed media environment, the way in which it distributes disinformation, the way in which it makes us so certain of our prior convictions, the way in which it makes us believe that the other side is composed entirely of bad people who work with bad information, that's certainly playing a role. But I want to say, right, that what creates the fertile ground for social media polarization, for the spread and the contagion of disinformation, is in part a society in which we have deep, glaring inequality, and it appears to be simply unfair and wrong. And then people want someone to blame, and they blame whoever they can find that's an easy target. The other side politically, immigrants in our midst, DEI initiatives that allow people less deserving than people like us to jump the line in front of us. And so today I will start a conversation. I hope that we'll get a fair way with it, may return to it, about inequality as a master variable in explaining a lot of what is wrong in American society and American politics in the last decade. So I'm going to start with the program that I'm using as a jumping off point. And please note, right, as the government shutdown now enters its second month, it's not just supplemental nutrition assistance, or as we used to call it, food stamps, right? It is a variety of programs that are all poverty relieving programs. So WIC, with the program for women with infants and children that provides nutritional assistance, is also in harm's way. And so too is the program that provides heating assistance for people who live in cold climates. And we know when these programs are defunded, people turn off the heat, stop buying food, children, infants are damaged by malnutrition. People actually freeze to death in the United States because they don't have access to this aid. So with that background in mind, let's look at SNAP not as the only thing that matters, but as an illustrative case. And so a few different things I want you to see about SNAP. This is the number of people on the SNAP program, right? And it's measured in tens of millions, so that's 40 million people. And I hope you can see, right? It's a program that's started in the late 1960s. It takes about a decade for it really to come online in terms of the benefits getting out to everybody who's qualified for it, or at least most people. And then for the next roughly 30 years, it is a program that somewhere between 20 and 30 million people, on average a little bit less than 25 million people, gain benefits from. And what tends to drive increases is recessions, decreases, periods of sustained economic growth. And that is because the benefit is available, you are eligible for it if you are within 130% of the official poverty level, which is not a very generous level to begin with. And so when the economy is contracting, more people are at that qualifying level of income. When the economy is growing, fewer people are. But then beginning around 2000, we have this steady increase in eligibility for the benefits, despite the fact that we're not in a recessionary period. And then, of course, in 2007, 2008, we have the Great Recession. That pushes the number of people in the program up substantially. But please note, as the economy recovers, the number of recipients does not decline to anything like its pre-recession average. Far from it, we seem to have a new and fairly stable population of somewhere around 40 million people for the last 15 plus years now, or to put it in percentage terms, around 12% of the American population seems to rely on supplemental nutrition assistance even when the economy is growing. And I think that the right way to refer to this is in terms of working poor, right? That there are people, as a matter of fact, almost 80% of the beneficiaries of this program who have employment, many of them full-time employment, some of them multiple jobs, who nevertheless are not making enough to feed themselves or to get more than 30% above the official poverty rate. And so the result is that we are not going to grow our way out of economic precariousness and vulnerability in an economy where the wage structure is so unequal and the bottom of the wage structure is so low. One of the features that you might point to in explaining this is the failure to increase the minimum wage. If the minimum wage had kept up with inflation and the cost of living, then if it were a genuine living wage, even better, then right, people being employed might actually give them the wages to feed their families. If we had higher rates of unionization, then workers might have a capacity to hold out for a living wage. The explanations here are complex, but the picture is clear that large numbers of Americans, 1 in 8 roughly, rely on government assistance despite the fact that they work to be able to feed their families. It is also geographically uneven. There are places in the United States where less than 10% of the population relies on these benefits. And then there are places in the United States where it's as high as 15, 20, 25%. And there are places in the United States where a third of the population relies on these benefits. These benefits amount to, right, somewhere between $250 and in excess of $1,000 a month. It depends, of course, on your household size. But on average, the benefits are not much more than $250, $300 a month. We'll see some details on that in a moment. And please note, while 40% of the population who receives these benefits are adults in their working age prime, right? 60% are adults over 60, children younger than 5, or children ages 5 to 17. And so a large portion of the people who are going to suffer, who do suffer, right, are those whom we don't think are directly responsible for earning their own wages, right? So again, these figures vary, right? 50% are, right, this is actually the government's data from a couple years ago. 50% of the people who benefit from this program, right, are households with children, households with elderly individuals, households with disabled individuals. You add it all together, that gets us up to almost 80% of the beneficiaries include a child, an elderly individual, or an individual with a disability. The average benefit, $297 a month. And by the way, this lifts 75% of the households who get it above the poverty level. I'm sorry, I'm misreporting what my diagram says. The households that get the benefit are below the poverty level. When they get the benefit, 30% of them are lifted above the poverty level. Let me keep going because I don't want to get dragged down too deeply in these right data points about a single program. I want to spend a little bit more time on poverty in the United States, and just to give you an overall picture. I want to start by juxtaposing two different ways of measuring poverty. In 1959, nearly 1 in 4 Americans lived below the federal poverty rate. Um, Today, that figure is 12.3%. So basically, we've cut poverty in half in terms of a percentage of the population in the United States in a 60 odd year period. And the main way we've done this is through poverty fighting policy. And so I want to be as clear as possible. Ronald Reagan once said in 1980, right, that the Democrats had declared war on poverty and they lost the war. Poverty won. It's just not true, which is to say that these programs work. But two things. The first is we're a much larger society in the 21st century than we were in the middle of the 20th century. So the number of people in poverty has gone down and then come back up. So the absolute number of people in poverty in the United States is 40 million today, and it was right about 40 million in 1959. And what this indicates, I think, to most people is that we have a stubborn problem with poverty. In a sense, our poverty fighting measures succeeded, and yet they were probably not aggressive, sustained, or well funded enough to really eliminate or at least radically reduce poverty. And please note that both of these figures are very high for the developed world. Finally, the composition of the people in poverty has changed. And again, this is an indication of how policy works and where policy is working well and where it isn't working well. People who are age 65 and older are now much less likely to be poor than they were in the 1950s. Of course, the fact that Medicare came online and covers so many of the costs associated not only with medical care, but also with various other kinds of care that people require at the end of their life is extremely important. Policy matters, right? And please note, that although the number of children in poverty has decreased, they have become the single largest group in poverty in the United States. They account for about 20% of the poverty rate. Why? is the government shutdown. And this is right, a fight that's playing out in Washington today. I'm going to say something about the politics. I'm trying not to be directly partisan in my analysis of this, but the simple right issue, the sticking point, the reason the Democrats are refusing to vote in favor of a continuing resolution is because the one big beautiful bill eliminates the subsidy increase for the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, that was put in place in 2021, extended in 2022, and expires in 2025. And what we know in terms of what this policy did, right, it more than doubled the number of people on Obamacare, right? And we'll get into this in a moment, but the likely outcome is that many of the people who joined Obamacare will leave Obamacare and will therefore not have health care, not have access to reliable preventative care, and that this will further increase their sense of vulnerability and exclusion in the United States. When we look at this in a little bit more detail, removing the subsidies hits different families at different rates. Sorry, I think I covered up part of the title here and putting my new diagram in. But the thing that has changed since the last time we've talked about this is we now have the actual figures as opposed to projections. And what we see is that the average ACA premium is going to roughly double, go up by about $1,000 a year, and that this will be unevenly distributed. Oh, I see what I did. I meant to have this diagram on this slide, not the previous slide. And that, right, it depends on your age, it depends on your income, it depends on your location in the country. But speaking in very broad terms, Obamacare premiums will go up about 25%, about $1,000 per year. And that means that roughly 7 to 10 million people are likely to drop Obamacare coverage. And so this is what the Democrats are fighting for. And they think they've identified a vulnerability on the part of Trump and the Republicans, that they passed this one big beautiful bill, and we've talked about this together before. It doesn't just, right, kick a lot of people off of Medicaid and Obamacare. It also makes it very likely that people are going to lose SNAP benefits even when the program reopens, right? And what we're talking about here is, right, millions of people losing their access to assistance in getting the nutrition they need, meaning, right, that 33% of children, about 22 million, will be removed from the rolls of this program. And that the overall effect of the One Big Beautiful Bill, as we've noted before, is bad, right, for, let's say, 80% of Americans, especially when combined with tariffs. They result in a decrease in income affordability of 7% for the least well-off among us, but on average 2%, 3% for many of the rest of us. And so the fight over the Affordable Care Act, it seems to me, is really a fight over the priorities of the Trump administration and the Republican Make America Great Again program in Congress. What is it they care about? They care about making the tax cuts for the wealthiest in our society permanent, not about programs that alleviate the vulnerability and the suffering of the most vulnerable in our society, right? So that's why we don't have these programs. Now, I want to say just a little bit about inequality, and this will be right, a review at first, and then I'll get into some of the more recent data. As we know, income inequality increased, and I don't know the right word for it, dramatically, grotesquely. It's really hard to look at this diagram, right, and see how equal we were in terms of the distribution of income in the 1960s, and how rapidly, thoroughly, dramatically we departed from the hard-won inequality of the New Deal and the Great Society programs and went back to a new Gilded Age in which the top 5% are making more than 30 times as much as the bottom 20%. But it's not just that the top 20% and the top 5% now live in just a completely different world from the rest of America. It is also that much greater inequality opened up among the bottom 80%, right? It was the case that in the 1960s, the bottom 80% were living very comparable lives. And today, right, there are these vast chasms of difference between the people in the bottom 80%, which don't, right, look as pronounced when you compare them with the people in the top 20 or the top 5%, but are real and are really poisoning our capacity to believe that we really live in one society with a strong sense of solidarity and fairness in which we care about those at the bottom. If we did, then we would not have these levels of inequality. And it is increasingly obvious, painfully obvious to the people at the bottom. And if you think of yourself as an equal person, as an equal citizen, as someone who matters, then it's hard not to be angry about this. Very quickly, although the level of income inequality is extraordinary, it is dwarfed by the level of wealth inequality, right? And so we see top 1% control 31% of the wealth in our society. The top 10% control more than 2/3 of the wealth in our society. The bottom 50% control less than 2% of the wealth in our society. And many of these people, frankly, are simply underwater. They owe more than the value of what they own. And if you want an explanation of this, it's quite simple. You go back to this diagram. If you are earning $11,000 or $30,000 or $50,000 per year per household in the United States, how in the world can you save? Right? You can't. You don't invest. You just try to stay above water. I want to get into the human costs of inequality. I think this is extraordinarily important. As I was thinking about SNAP, I listened to a number of interviews of people who were in harm's way, who were about to lose their benefits. And it was heart-wrenching to hear people hypoglycemic, people who need food right at the right time, or their body is going to start to malfunction. They're going to enter a health crisis. People who have children who go off to school, who they have ambitions and hopes for, who they recognize that if they don't have food in their belly, they're not going to be able to concentrate in class. They're going to become, right, potentially problem students in school, misbehave, etc. And so the idea that it's not just about the distribution of wealth and income numbers on a chart. It is about whether or not people feel secure in our society, whether or not they feel that they are acknowledged and respected by their peers, whether or not instead they feel like they are looked down upon or even worse, invisible, right? They just don't matter. And so the idea that we are seeing signs that the level of inequality is generating anxiety, status loss for large portions of the United States is reflected in a variety of different data. The deaths of despair data is very clear, right? And the idea that the increase in deaths of despair this century is strongly correlated with educational level, I think is extremely important to note as part of what has happened to our economy as we've become a post-industrial, much more of a knowledge and service economy, is that education matters more. And if you don't have a BA, you are feeling that you don't matter, that you are not viable. And this is leading people to take their own lives, to abuse drugs and alcohol. It is, right, a epidemic. It has shown some signs of abating recently, but it is also very strongly correlated. Where the industrial economy was strongest, where those jobs went away, where no alternative economy that supports economically but also socially those who don't have the educational qualifications to transition to a post-industrial economy, that's where the deaths of despair are most highly concentrated. I'll say this briefly for now, but again, I think that this is just a remarkable diagram. This compares people born in 1930 and people born in 1960 in terms of their life expectancy. It focuses on, in the first instance, men, and in the second instance, women. And what it shows is that if you are rich, if you're in the highest income group, the top 20%, you are living maybe 10 years longer than the people a couple generations back. But if you are in the lowest income group, your lifespan has actually contracted as opposed to grown. And I do think that the best explanation of this is that we were a more equal society. And so the people at the bottom of the economic income distribution um, felt more included, felt less anxiety, less status anxiety and evaluative threat. And we know that in the 21st century, with all the advances in medicine, one of the worst things for your health is to feel anxiety, and that increased income inequality increases in, that level of social evaluative threat and the anxiety associated with it. It's not just that we've become a much more unequal society. As you know, I think we've also become a much less mobile society, right? So that's what this diagram gets us to. If you're born in the bottom 20%, if your parents were already in the bottom 20%, well, there's in excess of a 40% chance that that's where you will stay for the rest of your life. If you bring in the next 20%, right, that's accounting for almost 70% of the people born at the bottom 20%. They don't escape poverty. The people who actually make it to the top, infinitesimally small, right? If you're born in the top 20%, 40% chance you're going to stay there. Bring in the next 20%, and again, you're up to almost 2/3 of the people born in the top 20% stay at the top for their entire lives. And we know this is inherited advantage or inherited disadvantage, and this is just the nature of living in an unequal society. This is sometimes referred to as the Great Gatsby curve, which says that increased inequality is directly correlated with less economic mobility. The differences between the classes are greater, so it's harder to climb, but also the people at the top recognize that if their children fall, they're going to fall further. And so they invest more in maintaining their privilege across generations. And what that means for the people at the bottom is that they know that the people at the top are preferring passing on their privilege to their children, their descendants, over doing what justice, fairness, concern, democracy requires, creating a more equal and a more mobile society. To get at this in the most glaring ways, right? The idea that the top 1% now gets 20% of the income of our society, whereas the bottom 50% get less than the top 1% in income each year, right? Somewhere around 13% of the income. The idea that the wealth of the top 1% is growing astronomically, while the wealth of the bottom 50% is completely stagnant. And please note, for most of the 21st century, the wealth of the bottom 50% has been negative, not positive, in this society. They have had more debt than wealth. And this, in the richest society in the world, in a society where our economy has grown in a way that makes us the envy of the rest of the developed world. We may have growth, but we certainly are not distributing it fairly. Last, I think, diagram on this, and perhaps the one that is most revealing, right? So this is what a bifurcated economy, an up or out economy, looks like. Who is spending in the economy? Well, almost 50% of what is spent in our economy is spent by the top 10%. Our economy has become reliant on the conspicuous consumption, on the consumption of luxury goods by the top 10% of our society. I get in my Sunday paper various real estate firms advertising their various high-end properties. And I regularly see properties advertised at $30 million, $25 million. And by the way, they don't advertise anything that costs less than $2 million, right? Who can afford to buy that kind of home? And the idea, well, it turns out that this is what makes the real estate industry function, is the purchase of luxury homes, in the same way that the airlines make almost all of their profits from selling first class and business class tickets, not from the coach, right? And you can see this very clearly. The bottom 20% of our society spends basically only a little bit more than 1/20th of what the top 10% spend. This is just a glaring inequality of expenditure. And so we see this in a little bit more of an overall x-ray, one moment, of income in our society, right? We have, right, a large portion, the largest portion of our society, almost 50% of our society, living on $31,000 a year or less, right? And what do these people conclude about our economy, our society, our politics, our democracy? Well, first of all, prosperity is just unattainable. We might have been educated with Horatio Alger stories, but this doesn't work. This is not true. This is a society where when you're born at the bottom, that's where you're stuck. It's essentially a caste society. The government lacks the capacity to help. Many of these people voted for Barack Obama, voted for Joe Biden, and they invested hope in them, right? They saw the policies they were passing, they saw the rhetoric accompanying those policies, and they said, well, maybe our situation will get better. And as opposed to that, the situation got worse, right? And so in the politics of the 21st century, if it's a competition between hope and anger, between saying we will come together and solve our problems and saying, here's the people you should hate and blame, well, anger is definitely more credible than hope in light of the policy and the nature of our society in the 21st century. And this leads to the final conclusion that seems to me to be quite widespread. Society lacks the cohesion to care about the people who are left out of prosperity. We, the rich, are happy enough to have our big homes, our cool cars, our good educational opportunities for our children. That's where we're going to concentrate our efforts. And well, we may care about immigrants and we may care about the environment and we may care about homosexuals or about DEI, right? The redressing of historical injustice with regards to African Americans or Latinos or immigrants, but we don't care enough about the people at the bottom of the economy who don't fit those categories, who are left out. And so they feel, well, maybe I'm actually not really part of the same society with the people who are doing better. Maybe I shouldn't care that my president sends our troops into their cities and terrorizes them. I want to try to sum this up by noting that we have both a tremendous hollowing out of the middle class, right? It was the case for a long period at the second half of the 20th century that the middle class was the largest proportion of our population. But that has ceased to be the case. They've been passed by upper income people and passed, right, by lower income people in terms of both sheer numbers and distribution of wealth. I think I need to correct that. In terms of distribution of wealth, the upper income have passed the middle class. In terms of sheer numbers, the middle income is still the largest group, but the upper income has grown. So too is the lower income, and the result is a hollowing out of the middle class. And if you want to talk about how middle class people in the United States gain wealth, the single most important asset they own is a house. We've spoken about this already. Millions of Americans lost their home in the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Maybe 7 to 10 million people were foreclosed upon. And if you're trying to get back to home ownership, please note that the average required income to purchase a home in the United States today is about 120,000. The average income in the United States is about 80,000, right? So for most Americans, home ownership is out of reach. And so this reflects then an affordability crisis. Housing is too expensive. Healthcare is too expensive. Higher education is too expensive. Child and elder care is too expensive. Our incomes are not keeping up with the cost of essential goods in our society. So more and more people are going into consumer debt, right? This is looking at the 21st century and the cresting of consumer debt in the buildup to the 2008 Great Recession. It goes back down, but it's gone back up again. Looking at it in a longer term picture, right? In the last half of the 20th century, net savings was positive, right? People were actually able to afford their cost of living and save. As we get into the last decade of the 21st century, we cross a threshold, right? Where wages don't keep up with the cost of living. And so what we see is increasing consumer debt. And this is clearly, right, a problem right now. This is 2024, right, the end of last year, the highest level of household debt in the history of the United States. So I'll conclude today by saying two more things. And one of them is that we need to be humane. We need to be concrete. We need to be empathic about what poverty does to people. Matthew Desmond's Poverty by America has, among many advantages, it's a wonderful book about an awful topic, a very clear indication of what poverty does to the impoverished. Quick quote: poverty is often material scarcity piled on chronic pain, piled on incarceration, piled on depression, piled on addiction. It goes on. Poverty isn't a line, it's a tight knot of social maladies. It's connected to to every social problem we care about: crime, education, housing. And its persistence in American life means that millions of families are denied safety and security and dignity in one of the richest nations in the history of the world. So poverty, right, literally increases physical pain. The conditions people work in, their incapacity to afford new shoes, new clothes, medicine causes physical pain. It causes poor health. It exposes them to violence in the neighborhoods they live in. It traumatizes children who don't know if there's enough to eat, don't know if they're going to be evicted or not. It causes instability in housing. 40% of Americans, according to Desmond, are evicted in the 21st century, right? Stunning statistic. It leads people to take bad jobs because they don't have the economic security to hold out for a good job. It leads to fear that this is a downward spiral, that you're going to transition from deep to absolute poverty, from housing insecurity to homelessness, right? It very often leads to incarceration, especially for the children of the poor, and they experience constant surveillance and discipline by the government, humiliation in their everyday life. It diminishes their lives, they lead less long lives, and it diminishes their sense that they're full people within our society. I do want to tie this to politics, and I do want to say two things very quickly. The first is, right, that the United States has the highest number of veto players or veto points in our democratic world, right? This is part of our system of checks and balances. Legislation has to get through both houses of Congress, be signed by the president, upheld by the Supreme Court. And in Congress, there are multiple procedures that allow us to block legislation. Right now, we're bemoaning the fact that checks and balances are not effectively preventing tyrannical activity from the president of the United States. But we should also note that checks and balances keep the Democratic Party from passing the kind of legislation that might actually lead to a reduction in poverty. And that as we get more and more unequal, as the wealthy get more and more concentrated income, well, they have greater and greater access to those veto points and are better able to block the legislation that might help, right? We see this, these are familiar diagrams now, right? Average citizens' preferences have statistically insignificant chance of influencing whether legislation is passed or not when that legislation contradicts what economic elites or interest groups want passed. But when economic elites want legislation passed, boy, does the likelihood of it being passed go up. When those who can afford lobbyists lobby on the behalf of the bills they want passed. Boy, does the likelihood of it going up pass. And this means essentially what is obvious when we look at these diagrams, right? The cost of elections, the amount of money in elections, this is measured in billions of dollars, keeps going up. And the amount contributed to financing elections of the top 0.01%, it's up to over 40% of the expenditures in our elections. So we know legislation works, right? When we did child tax credits during the Great Recession, I'm sorry, during the COVID pandemic, right? We saw poverty come down substantially, especially childhood poverty was cut in half. The poverty of all American racial groups, of all Americans based in their geography, went down dramatically. Look at this, right? The normal pattern is when the economy grows, right, the poverty rate goes down. When the economy recedes, the poverty rate goes up. In 2021, in the grips of a COVID-caused recession, poverty went down overall more dramatically than it has at any point in American history for 50 years. This is a simple policy to pass. When we pass it, what we see is that people spend the money on food, utilities, rent, mortgage, clothing, educational costs. They use the money constructively. But the big, beautiful bill cuts this. The Democrats, when Biden was in office, couldn't extend this. We are not a society right now with a polity that functions to allow us to combat poverty. We need to reckon with what this is doing to our politics. It is dividing us, it is tearing us apart, and it is the most pressing problem of 21st century America. I will stop there. I'm sure giving you a fair bit to think about, a fair bit to worry about. Let me take your questions, thoughts, comments. Who wants to start us out today? Flossie, go ahead, but you got to unmute yourself. I've sent you the little thing to push, hopefully.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you go. Yes, go ahead.
Poverty has another effect. If you get out of it by taking any job you can, by helping out people who are elderly and who need help, but who don't have enough money to be able to pay for, let's say, living at Piedmont's Gardens, I have observed that the people who help generally and have come out of poverty themselves tend not to be as tender and as caring as they might be because they have not received that themselves. And so, on occasion, they can actually be brutal to those who are really helpless, but who may be able to afford some payment. You don't see that every day, but when you see it on occasion, you see that one thing leads to another. It doesn't stop that once you get out of poverty, you become another human being. You carry the scars with you, and you carry it so that you are able to experience power that you never had before. Something to think about.
Yeah,
And
interesting, Flossie.
oh, yes.
Thank you for that comment. And so I think it's incredibly complicated. I'll start with the fact that the poorest people in our society give more to charity than the richest people in our society do, right? And this reflects, I think, a couple of things. Partly that they attend church, and that on average poor people attend church, but also belong in solidarity networks. They recognize their vulnerability, and when they're able to, they help others in part because they anticipate that they may need help later and they want the reciprocity, but in part also because of increased sympathy, right? They know what it's like to be hungry, to not know whether you're going to make rent or be evicted. And so when somebody else is going through that, they tend to be quite sympathetic and generous if they can be, right? But having said that, I do think it is also the case that poverty traumatizes, and that the scars, right, of having grown up in uh, sustained insecurity, um, influence different people in different ways. If you do manage to escape poverty, maybe you want to pat yourself on the back and take full credit for it and just say, as I hear people say all the time, well, I did it, why can't they? Right? But I think it influences different people in different ways. One thing is clear: there are lasting effects to having grown up in poverty. It doesn't right. It's not something you can just right close the door on if you do make it to economic security. Yeah. Thank you, Flossie, as always. Um, Anybody else today? Let me say one more thing. And it's simple. I hope that in the next few days, these funds will begin to flow again. But I'm certainly not confident that that's the case. While I think it's a very bad look for Donald Trump to care more about building a ballroom than about feeding 40 million Americans, I think it's absolutely clear that that is his priority. And I'll say this very briefly. I do think that this is actually probably damaging Donald Trump politically, right? His approval ratings are at the lowest level they've been. And I think there's a sense in which, right, this kind of politics is self-defeating, right? If you act on the basis of your anger and say, I'm going to vote for somebody who promises to punish the other side, but that person doesn't really care about policy that benefits people like you. When push comes to shove, you will find out that they're not going to support those policies, right? So having said all of that, what I will say is, I don't know if this administration is actually going to get those benefits out quickly in time to help people. We do know that the funding is inadequate to the need. And we also know, frankly, that the amount dispersed per month by the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, $9 billion almost, is about 17 times the amount spent by states and charity put together, right? So there's no patchwork. There's no right fixing this at some other level. But the if we do want to pitch in, we can find our local food banks. We can find food banks anywhere in the United States, and we can contribute. So if you're moved by this and you don't just want to say, oh no, another depressing lecture, this country just keeps getting worse, you want to do something, well, there are things that you can do that will have concrete benefits for the people who are in harm's way right now. And I would encourage you to think about doing that as well. That, fixing this politically, my God, it's a complicated mess and it's really hard to figure out what to do. Intervening in your community or with your pocketbook, if you're able, that's something you can do relatively easily and that is going to be effective immediately. So I'd encourage you to think about that if you're looking for something to do that might help in the short term to at least alleviate some of the suffering that is unfolding as a result of the mess in American politics right now. Thank you, guys. good being with you as always. Be well, and I will talk with you more next week. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good seeing you
Thank you.
guys. Bye bye.
Bye.